Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today I wanted to give some love to the overlooked and underappreciated characters in the game. In the 2.5 years that I've been doing guides to Baldur's Gate 3, I've seen a lot of opinions on how to build characters, and I think that there are a few characters that people consistently underrate how powerful they actually are. So today we're going to talk about the 8 most underrated subclasses in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I'm not claiming that these are the 8 best subclasses in the game, mostly far from it, but that mostly also doesn't matter. Optimization is a tool to let you have fun and do what you want, and your tools should serve you, not the other way around. These are all classes that you frequently see people say they're not playable in Honor mode. I myself have made this mistake with several of them in the past, and that's simply not true. So I wanted to go through and talk about their actual strengths and weaknesses, what they actually bring to the table, why people tend to think they're weak, and we can talk a little bit about sort of common traps to fall into in evaluating characters and why people might tend to underrate these and systematic mistakes that people make in character evaluation. And then, of course, look at what their actual strengths and weaknesses are, and hopefully open your eyes to playing a character that you might not otherwise have considered. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Tarantula for the $5 donation, I Am Quail for the $2, Josh Hobbs for the $5, and Sarah, Neil R., and Lane Lambs for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means so much to me. Alright, let's talk underrated characters. Let's just jump right into it, and we're going to lead off with number 8, Nature Cleric. So if I had been making this list a year ago, Nature Cleric I think would have been number 1 on this list. The initial perception was that Nature Cleric was a very weak cleric domain, and I think that the community has mostly come around on that and realized that Nature Clerics are actually very strong, in part because I relentlessly evangelize how powerful this character actually is. But I think that it's still somewhat underrated, and people aren't realizing just how strong Nature Clerics are, when they are, in fact, on this list by far the strongest subclass that we're going to talk about, and one of the overall most powerful subclasses in the game. You can see here that what we're going to do is we're going to go through the strengths of these subclasses. I'll talk about the quote-unquote weaknesses, which are factors that I think lead people to underrate how powerful they are in truth. And then, of course, their actual weaknesses so that you get a good sense of what the real strengths and weaknesses of the characters are. Before we do that, though, let's just quickly go over the subclass abilities so we're all on the same page. So I'm going to jump over to the wiki page. So, Nature Domain is, of course, a Cleric domain, so all of these abilities are on top of the already awesome abilities that Cleric gets, and the great thing about Nature Domain is it really shores up the very few weaknesses that Clerics have as a class. Let's take a quick look at the abilities. So, you get Heavy Armor Proficiency, very useful for Clerics, helps smooth out your gear requirements, and there's some great Heavy Armor sets. And you get, at first level also, your choice of one of 4 Druid cantrips. Poison Spray and Produce Flame we can safely ignore, but Shillelagh and Thorn Whip are both very useful, and Shillelagh in particular solves one of the major problems that Clerics have, or one of the very few problems that Clerics have, which is low sustained damage in the early game. Shillelagh gives you a great melee attack, so it makes you just a very solid damage dealer in addition to all of the support and control that you're already bringing to the table. You get one of 3 skill proficiencies that mostly don't matter. These don't come up that frequently in Baldur's Gate 3. And then, like other Cleric domains, the real draw is the domain spell list. Nature Domain has an incredible spell list, headlined by 3 spells in particular. Spike Growth at level 3, and then at level 5 you get Sleet Storm and Plant Growth. Spike Growth and Sleet Storm are some of the most powerful spells in the game. They're going to by themselves solve a lot of encounters. Spike Growth wins a lot of Act 1, more or less by itself. So having these on your Cleric gives you AoE damage, something that you're missing on Nature Clerics, and access to some of the very best spells in the game on top of your already great spell access. The other spells on the list are less impactful, but even just access to those 3 is by itself incredible. In addition to that, you get Dampen Elements. This is a free reaction that lets you have elemental damage dealt to you or a party member, so it makes your whole party significantly more resilient against elemental damage. And then you also get Divine Strike, which lets you add a little damage to your melee attacks. By the time you get that, you won't be making that many melee attacks, so this ability usually won't come up. You'll notice that I skipped Charm Animal and Plants, the domain ability here. That's because this is very, very weak overall and usually will not come up in Baldur's Gate 3, so this one's a bit of a miss, but the incredible spell lists that this character gets and the great defensive ability are already a really solid basis for a subclass. So what do Nature Clerics actually bring to the table? Why should you play one? So, of course, they have the best domain spell list of any of the cleric domains. I think that people consistently underrate spell access as a balanced consideration for clerics and overrate domain abilities. Obviously, both are important, but having access to really good spells that clerics don't normally get is extremely powerful, and nature clerics get the best ones. Spike Growth and Sleet Storm are premium spells, super powerful in a vacuum, and Plant Growth is a really nice one for clerics to have as well as a non-concentration control option. But these spells are even better on nature clerics because they perfectly fill the gaps in clerics' normal spell access. Clerics can struggle with AoE control for large encounters, and Sleet Storm and Spike Growth both help with that entirely. Spike Growth also solos a lot of Act 1, and clerics are at their weakest before they hit level 5, so getting a huge power spike at Act 2 from having access to Spike Growth is really strong. In addition, Shillelagh gives you consistent early game damage for the first 3 levels or so, and that's something that clerics can also struggle with. That was more true before Toll the Dead existed, but it's still a consideration for clerics. So nature clerics' spell lists and class abilities perfectly fill the gaps in cleric's normal ability list, meaning that this character ends up with practically no actual weaknesses. In addition to your awesome domain spell list, you just get overall a ton of control. You get cleric's normal control with command and radiating orbs and everything, and then add on more from nature cleric. You get heavy armor proficiency and great defenses overall with the aforementioned heavy armor and the ability to reduce elemental damage. You're also a cleric, so you're going to have high wisdom, so you won't be failing wisdom saves. So this character, again, ends up with very few weak points. There's no point where you are vulnerable to enemy attacks. You're good against spells, damage spells, control spells, weapon attacks. There's just nothing that enemies can do that you actually really care about. So overall, it covers the very few weaknesses in Cleric's normal kit perfectly, leaving a character with effectively no weaknesses. So why do people tend to think that this character is a little bit on the weaker side? And again, I want to say that Nature Cleric is one of the ones where people have more or less cottoned on to how good this character is, but still I think is systematically underrated. Well, one of them is a very understandable reason. Dampen Elements used to cost a channel domain charge, so you could only use it on short rest instead of just all the time. And so, obviously, a significant buff to the character made it a lot stronger. It was already good before that, but that's a massive buff that makes Nature Cleric's parties significantly harder to kill. The other reason is just that there are other really strong cleric subclasses. Light is better at applying radiating orbs, and Tempest has lots of ridiculous damage combos, so they tend to get all the hype. And people who are looking to do healing as a cleric will tend to pick Life Cleric. Nature Cleric falls somewhere in the middle, and characters that are really good at covering a lot of roles, people tend to systematically underrate. Another theme that we're going to see a lot in this list is that people underrate control-oriented characters, and Nature Cleric, of course, is control-oriented. The reason for this, I think, is essentially that damage is very easy to evaluate. It's very visceral and very visual. You can see a big number, and if the number is really big, then you know that it's good. Judging how much damage an enemy didn't do because they weren't acting is much harder. There's no combat log entry for that. It doesn't say, by the way, you didn't take 100 damage because you put Spike Growth down and all the gnolls were stuck. So it's a little harder to evaluate its impact on the actual game. And so control-oriented characters tend to be systematically underrated in Baldur's Gate 3. Obviously, you can play the game just by doing enough damage to kill everything. It's a very, very powerful strategy, but it's not the only strategy. And it's one that people, I think, tend to overlook other strategies because damage is so dominant in discourse around the game. Given that those are the weaknesses that I think aren't that important, but that people perceive, let's look at the actual weaknesses. And we already really talked about what Nature Cleric's weaknesses are. In practice, none. This character can go in any team composition. It's always going to be incredibly effective. Enemies don't really have any options for playing against it, and you're always going to have options. It is true that your Channel Domain ability is quite weak, but you, generally speaking, won't cast it, and Divine Strike doesn't synergize with what you want to do, but you just won't use that ability, and that doesn't really matter. Another thing that I think can sometimes trap people is the existence of a weak ability doesn't make the whole subclass weak. You just ignore that ability and use the things that are strong. So Nature Cleric, in practice, is just overall incredibly powerful and with very, very few weaknesses. Just a very good character overall. Coming in at number 7, Conjuration Wizards. So once again, we're going to hop over to the wiki and take a look at this character's abilities so that we all know what they do before we talk about their strengths. So Conjuration Wizards are, of course, wizards, so they get all of the wizard spellcasting and scroll access that wizards normally get. In addition, from their subclass, they get halving the cost of conjuration spells of learning conjuration spells from scrolls. This is the same for every wizard school, and you can safely ignore this ability on all of the wizard schools. On top of that, they get minor conjuration, Create Water, which lets you cast Create Water once per short rest. Create Water is normally only available to clerics and druids, so it's really nice having it on a wizard, which have lots of lightning damage, and can benefit a lot from having this ability. The cool ability that they get, though, is Benign Transposition Teleport, which is an action-based teleport, once per long rest, but you can refresh it by casting any conjuration spell. This includes ritual spells, so you can use Find Familiar in order to refresh as a ritual outside of combat, in order to refresh your charge of Benign Transposition, and it lets you teleport up to 60 feet or swap places with an ally. And there's obviously a lot of really cool tactical options that you can do with the ability to teleport or move allies around the battlefield. Finally, at level 10, you get Focused Conjuration, which means that when you're concentrating on a conjuration spell, so that includes things like Cloud Kill, Cloud of Daggers, and a bunch of other conjuration spells, damage that you take won't break your concentration, which, of course, for any control caster that's going to be concentrating on spells a lot is ridiculously strong. Not losing concentration is one of the main goals of spellcasters. So when you put that together, the strengths of Conjuration Wizard are really, all of the subclass abilities are pretty good, other than the scroll scribing one, and in fact they're all very strong overall. Create Water is really strong on a wizard. Wizards get access to lots of cold and lightning damage, so with haste or a potion of speed, you can cast Create Water and then use one of those as spells to double the damage with the wet condition and instantly delete encounters. Create Water also scales really well the more characters in your party have it. Combine a Conjuration Wizard with a Tempest Cleric, and then you can cast Create Water and they can use Lightning Bolt, or the Tempest Cleric can cast Create Water and you can use Lightning Bolt, depending on who wants to spend a spell slot. So it gives you a lot more versatility to have it on multiple characters in the party. Free mobility, or mobility in general, is just incredible, and since this doesn't cost you a spell slot to use, it does take your action, which is of course a real cost, but lots of teleportation effects are worth spending an action on in combat, and it can often cost your wizard a turn, but buy a turn for the ally that you swapped with. Let's say an enemy gets on top of your wizard, you swap your barbarian into that location, and now your barbarian is getting to attack. Maybe they wouldn't have been able to reach melee range otherwise, and your wizard is safe. So it gives you a lot of extra really powerful tools for manipulating combat, and the fact that it doesn't cost a spell slot, it's not Misty Step, is incredibly strong, and it's a very unique effect. Being able to swap with an ally gives you tactical options that simply aren't available to any other character. Finally, immunity to concentration loss while concentrating on some of the spells that you want to be concentrating on in the late game, is just very good. Incidental damage breaking your concentration is always an issue for wizards, and Conjuration Wizards are much less at risk to that. So why do I think that this character tends to be underrated? Well, firstly, it's not flashy. It's not an evocation wizard dropping a fireball on the middle of a fight and frying themselves and their allies. It's not an abjuration wizard, which obviously are incredibly broken. So some of the other wizard spell schools have more visible impact on the game than Conjuration Wizard, which tends to have a more subtle impact. It also requires a little bit more game knowledge. You need to know things like how to use the wet combos and that those exist in the game at all, which obviously is widespread knowledge at this point, but wasn't always, and people's biases from before they sort of knew how strong those were do remain even after they've learned about those things. And then also, it requires you to have a little more awareness of tactical positioning to get the most use out of the teleport. Being able to swap allies is only useful if you know that you can actually get good value out of it. And while Conjuration Wizard does give you some outs to play mistakes, like letting enemy melee characters get on your wizard, a lot of the most fun things you can do with it do require a little bit more advanced tactical knowledge. So I think it tends to be a little harder to play than some of the other characters. And that's partly why people tend to think that it's weaker. Its actual weaknesses, and of course this subclass does have some actual weaknesses, are that it's like really strong passive ability is at level 10. Create Water is nice, the Teleport is nice. Both of these are powerful abilities, but not as flashy or as overall impactful as like Abjuration or Divination Wizard's level 2 and 6 abilities. The Teleport takes an action, so it's very, as does the Create Water, so it is a very action-hungry class, which means you're probably going to want to have it drink potions or use haste to get the most value out of this class. So those are some real weaknesses, which means that you probably want it with more specific team compositions, but within those, it really shines. Coming in at number 6, and this is a character that I've definitely been guilty of underrating in the past, Arcane Trickster Rogue. Arcane Trickster Rogue, of course, gets all of the normal Rogue abilities, and Rogue is one of the classes that I think does need the most from its subclasses, because at later levels, Rogue gets not that much that's incredibly impactful as you level it up. But Arcane Trickster Rogue continues to provide additional benefits as you level it up, so it really helps with Rogue's later game weaknesses. Rogue often wants to be multiclassed because the benefits that you get from later levels aren't as strong as those of early levels, but Arcane Trickster Rogue really shores up those weaknesses. At level 3, you get Mage Hand Ledger Domain, which means that your Mage Hand lasts until long rest and is invisible. And you get Mage Hand for free, so you just learn the Mage Hand cantrip, so you can just use Mage Hand whenever you want. You also get 2 additional cantrips from the wizard spell list, and there's a lot of really strong cantrips for you, especially because Booming Blade now exists. And you get 2 first level spell slots and unlock some enchantment or illusion spells. Arcane Trickster Rogue has this gimmick where you learn enchantment or illusion spells, and that makes it look like your spell list isn't that strong, but you can replace those spells with whenever you level up and get the option to replace a spell with any spell from the wizard spell list. So functionally, it's just a more roundabout way of giving you access to every single spell that a wizard has of level 1 or 2. And there are lots of amazing spells for a rogue to have. Obviously, spells are very strong, so having access to every first and second level spell on a character that already gets good martial stats and good tricks and good things that it can do with skills is very, very powerful. So I'm not going to go over every single spell replacement or spell list that you get at every level, but basically you get access to a few spells, which can be any wizard spells from level 1 or level 2. At level 9 in Arcane Trickster Rogue, you also get Magical Ambush, which, while you're hiding, gives your targets disadvantage on saving throws against your spells. Normally, up until this point, Arcane Tricksters haven't been able to make great use of saving throw focused spells, because you probably don't have super high intelligence. Since you need high dexterity to do all your rogue stuff, you've been putting your ASIs into that. Magical Ambush makes up for that completely. Enemies who have disadvantage on the saving throw will fail more often if you have 16 intelligence than against a wizard with 20 intelligence. So you're going to land things like Hold Person more reliably than other characters will once you get access to Magical Ambush, even if you haven't been investing into Int. And of course you can do that as well. You don't get that much else from your subclass, but you do get additional spells as you level up, which smooths out the level curve significantly. In practice, what this means is a character that not only has pretty strong options, it has a lot of options, and those options are always relevant. I've called out here that Arcane Trickster Rogue never has nothing to do. And I think that that's, again, something that's systematically underrated in Baldur's Gate 3, is not having dead turns or points in the game where you don't have utility. If enemies are at range, you have great ranged attacks. If they're in melee, you have great melee attacks. You need a utility or defensive spell, you've got those. If all else fails, you're amazing at using items. You're one of the best item users in the game as well, because you're very mobile with your bonus action dashes, so you can always be in the right place and can activate items. Of course, you also have tons of utility out of combat with Rogue's awesome skill access and your spell access as well, shoring up your out of combat utility. So no matter the situation, no matter what your party is trying to do, an Arcane Trickster Rogue will always be able to help out. You are also extraordinarily difficult to kill. Although you don't have incredible hit points, rogues get a lot of inherent defensive abilities with uncanny dodge and evasion, defending their HP directly, and their mobility and bonus action hides, giving you a lot of ways to avoid taking damage. Arcane Trickster doubles down on that with access to things like shield and mirror image that make you even harder to attack. So enemies are just almost never going to be able to pin down and actually deal damage to an Arcane Trickster Rogue if you're playing it properly. You have a great bag of tricks that just gives you lots of incredible abilities, and unlike other rogues, you get a big power spike in the late game, whereas a lot of rogues don't have real class features after level 3. Arcane Trickster Rogues get their level 9 feature and get another huge power spike that also gives you a whole new way to play the game. People think that this character is weak, and I count myself among them as having mistakenly thought that this character was weak. In part, again, there was a real change in the game. Booming Blade didn't exist prior to patch 8, and that has shored up the damage of this character significantly. Booming Blade just adding a huge amount of free damage to your melee attacks obviously makes this character significantly better. It's also a much more defensively oriented character, and rogues are often seen as a damage-dealing class, though really they're more of a disruptive character that wants to be focusing damage on specific key targets, not huge amounts of raw damage. So a defensively oriented rogue feels a little bit jarring, I think, to people, and makes them underrate how good this is. It also, again, requires a little bit more tactical play. Rogues in general are slightly harder to play, and this adds the complexity of choosing and casting spells, and also positioning and hiding and everything. So there's a little bit more required of the player to make Arcane Trickster Rogue good. The real weaknesses of this character are it does have lower damage than most other damage characters. There's no getting around that. Rogues do less damage than other damage dealers. And you have a relatively narrow pool of strong spell choices, so it's easy to fall into traps when you pick the wrong spell and accidentally make your character worse, or cast a spell that doesn't do much because you don't have the save DC or whatever. So it's easier, especially for new players, to kind of hurt themselves when playing this character if they don't know how to pick spells. Check out my Arcane Trickster guide for more on spell selection here. So there are some real weaknesses to the character, but the strengths are very, very strong and very much worth playing. This character will always be fun to play and always have a lot to do. Coming in at number 5, it's another wizard, Illusion Wizards. Illusion Wizards only get a couple abilities, but they're really strong abilities. So at level 2, of course, you get the normal scroll discount, but you also get to cast Minor Illusion as a bonus action. This seems like it's not going to do much because Minor Illusion is mostly used outside of combat, but in practice, it gives you a lot of cool options. I go into these in a lot of detail in my Illusion Wizard guide, but basically you can use this to change enemy facing in combat so that you can hide more easily. You can use it to cause enemies to attack the Minor Illusion, which you can recast as a bonus action. They won't always do it, but it will cost them a lot of turns. And anytime you can cost an enemy a turn as a bonus action is always going to be good. At level 6, you get See Invisibility, which is mostly not a real ability. It's nice getting it for free, I guess, but this is a very, very weak spell, so mostly doesn't matter. But then at level 10, you get Illusory Self, which lets you, once per short rest, just turn an enemy hit into a miss. This negates critical hits, stops, obviously, the damage from the attack, but also stops any on-hit effects, things like poison or saving throws that you might make because the enemy hit you. So it makes a relatively squishy character have a lot more defensive options, and combined with things like shield and counterspell, gives you a lot of great ways to resist enemy attacks. So, fittingly, what that gives you is a character with just an absurd amount of weird tricks, which is exactly what you would want an Illusion Wizard to be. Minor Illusion is one of the abilities in the game with the most possible uses. There's tons of ways to use it in out-of-combat scenarios, to steal things, to group up enemies so you can blow them up with AoEs, to pull enemies away from their allies so that you can then assassinate them one by one, and being able to use it as a bonus action in combat gives you even more cool, tricky, and often quite powerful things that you can do as an Illusion Wizard. It will often just cause enemies to waste their turns attacking the Minor Illusion. However, this won't always happen. More on that in the weaknesses section. You also get the best defensive reaction in the game, in the late game, just saying no to any attack, including critical hits, so is, of course, extremely strong, and it combos well with your other defensive reactions that you get as a wizard. And, of course, you're a wizard. You have all of the wizard spellcasting. Wizards don't need much from their spell school in order to still be a very, very powerful character. The reason that people tend to think that this is on the weaker side and why it's one of the more forgotten subclasses in the game, I think, is, one, it's not damage oriented and it's doing weird, tricky things, which are really hard to analyze how impactful they're being in the game. Especially because it involves enemies skipping turns, which often is something that people don't notice or underrate. And it involves tools that you have that you may not be using to their full potential. So it's easy to underrate this character if you haven't explored what you can actually do with it. It's also, there are some really powerful wizard schools. Abjuration and Divination, of course, are ridiculously strong. So the other spell schools tend to suffer by comparison, but not everything has to be the most powerful thing you can possibly be. I will say that Illusion Wizard of the wizard spell schools is on the weaker side. Even though I think it's underrated, I do also think it's not one of the strongest subclasses for wizard, but it's still more than powerful enough for honor mode. You do also get a mostly useless level 6 ability. It's free, so you'll use it, but it's just not that impactful, and it does require a lot of tactical play. So that's why people tend to think that this character is very weak, whereas I think it is, generally speaking, pretty solid. There are some real weaknesses, though. Illusory Self is only on short rest. If it was once per turn, obviously that would maybe be too strong, but at that point in the game, a short rest defensive reaction is less impactful than you might hope for, even though it's an extremely strong one. And there's weird bugs using Minor Illusion in combat. Enemies will sometimes ignore it completely, or it won't change their facing when you're expecting it to. So there's definitely some issues that you can run into playing Illusion Wizards. But overall, this character has a really fun and super unique playstyle, and is very much worth checking out. Coming in at number 4, Beastmaster Ranger. And so my cat is in here, sitting on my lap while I'm recording, and as I tabbed over to this slide, he just let out the loudest fart. I don't know if it came through on the microphone. I'm definitely leaving this take in, because now we know what he thinks about Beastmaster Ranger. Beastmaster Ranger gets you a Beast Companion, effectively a whole extra summon that's with your party for the entire game. You can choose which one you select on a short rest. There's 5 different possibilities. And if it dies, you can resummon it. You can also change which one you're using every short rest in order if you want a specific one for a specific encounter. At level 5, and then again at level 7 and level 11, and level 8 and level 11, they also get additional abilities and additional bonuses, so they continue to scale with your character as you level up. I won't go over every single beast companion and all of their abilities. I will say that usually in the early game, the spider is the strongest one because it gives you the webs, which are just resource-free crowd control for the whole encounter. And then in the late game, you're usually going to end up using the dire raven because its ability to cast clouds of darkness every time it moves is incredibly powerful, one of the best capstone abilities in the game. But all of them have their place, and there's some really interesting things that you can do with the different companions. I highly encourage you to experiment and see which ones you like using the most. Another one that's really worth mentioning, by the way, is the goading roar on the bear companion. This doesn't do what it says at all, and is in fact no save disadvantage on all of their attacks for every enemy in the encounter, because it doesn't have any... It's supposed to taunt, but doesn't do that, and instead just gives them disadvantage on all their attacks. So this is also a very powerful crowd controlling tool. Everything that Beastmaster gets is either summoning the beast or making it better. That's all of its abilities. So what does Beastmaster Ranger bring to the table? Well, I mean, you get your beast, so you basically get 2 characters for the price of 1. The beast isn't as strong as a full character in your party, but it's not that far off at various levels. The ability to, for example, infinitely spam webs is probably better than what most of your characters are doing at that level. So there's a lot of points in the game where it's like having a whole 5th party member. In terms of damage, it's not contributing as much as another party member would, but when you look at the awesome versatility that having the various beasts brings to the table, and the great levels of control that you get, Beastmaster Ranger really is often getting a full extra party member for the price of only a single party slot. You also do very solid damage overall. You're a ranger, so you can use sharpshooter, have high dexterity, and just be a great support damage dealer with your archery. And your beast will contribute reasonable damage, though often the best uses for the beasts are not actually attacking, but using their abilities. Because they are squishy, so putting them in harm's way can be a little bit dangerous. So you get a character that brings really solid damage, great control, and great versatility so that you can do anything that your party needs and be helpful in every encounter. On top of that, Beastmaster Ranger has an extremely smooth level curve. You'll notice that the beasts get stronger at many points throughout the game, and that's really nice for rangers especially, which normally don't get a lot of impactful class abilities as they level up. So the fact that this helps your ranger scale, especially between level 5 and level 10, which are kind of dead levels for ranger, gives you a really nice power boost and lets you keep up with the difficulty of the game as you continue to level through. I think, in fact, that Beastmaster Ranger, the version that Larian has done, it has done such a phenomenal job of staying on power level for the game. I think that this basically hits the perfect balance point for Baldur's Gate 3 and is one of the characters that is most well balanced with the threats that you're presented at each point in the game, which obviously makes for the most fun and interesting playthroughs. You also get a lot of really powerful late game options. You get Darkness Abuse, you get Infinite Webs in the early game, you get Blinds from your Ravens and Disadvantage from your Bears, so you can do a lot of more powerful and more busted stuff, and especially the Darkness Abuse is really broken in the late game. Infinite Free Darkness, well not infinite, but nigh infinite Free Darkness, because it spawns a darkness cloud every time you activate the Raven's movement ability, is of course incredibly strong, with one of the strongest strategies in the game being Darkness Abuse. So why don't people think that this character is that good? I think that there's a couple factors that go into people underrating Beastmaster, which, for the record, I think is the second strongest ranger subclass after Gloomstalker. And of course, the first of these is that it's not Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker is ridiculously strong, super front-loaded, so it's at its best in the early game as well, which is when you need the power the most. And is also part of some of the most discussed builds in the game, with the various Gloomstalker Assassin and Gloomstalker Sword Bard archers being some of the darlings of character optimization. So it can often lead to the perception that that's the only ranger subclass that exists, which leaves Beastmaster and Hunter and now Swarmkeeper a little bit in the shadow of Gloomstalker, which is so powerful. This character also has a very high burden of knowledge to play, which can lead a lot of people to not try it. You need to look at all of the beasts and figure out what they do. Gives you a whole extra set of abilities and a whole other character to micromanage when you're playing the game. So it just does require more work from the player than other martial characters, which often you can just click attack every turn and you'll do just fine. Finally, Beastmaster also has like a weird history in Dungeons and Dragons, which I think does carry into the perceptions of it in Baldur's Gate. When it originally released in Tabletop 5th edition, Beastmaster was, frankly, terrible. It was totally cheeks. You could not use your beast and your character in the same turn. So you effectively just had a sack of dead hit points sitting there for enemies to kill for free, gaining no action economy. Wizards and players hated that so much that they reworked the character from the ground up. Then they hated that version, so they reworked it again from the ground up. And then people didn't really like that version very much either, so it received pretty significant changes in the 2024 edition of D&D 5th edition, so in the 5.5e. So this character has had 3 total reworks and been 4 different characters over its lifespan. And Larian has made a completely separate version for Baldur's Gate 3. So players who played tabletop with some of the older versions where Beastmaster was weak probably carry over a lot of those bad feelings. It's also, I think, often seen as kind of a noob class. I strongly disagree with this characterization, but a lot of new players are like, I really want a cool animal pet. And so players in tabletop who want to gatekeep Dungeons and Dragons tend to look down on this subclass, unfortunately. Obviously, you don't need to pay attention to those people, but they are very loud online, which can lead to some negative perceptions. So what are its real weaknesses? In practice, there aren't that many for Beastmaster Ranger. You have the tools to cover a lot of scenarios. But the beasts are squishy. You do need to be careful with them. Enemies can kill them. They have low AC and relatively low hit points, and less access to defensive tools than your party, so you need to be careful with your positioning. And it has low burst damage overall, good sustained damage with your beasts contributing and your consistent arrow fire or whatever weapon attacks you're using, but no upfront burst the way some other damage dealers have. So those are real weaknesses, but overall Beastmaster, I think, is a basically perfectly balanced class that makes for one of the most fun playthroughs for this game. And coming in at number 3, Archfey Warlock. So I do think that Archfey Warlock is the weakest of the 4 Warlock subclasses, but the weakest of the 4 Warlock subclasses is still an excellent character. So let's talk about what it actually gives you. Archfey Warlock gets Fey Presence at level 1, and this is the really strong draw for this class, because Fey Presence is an extremely powerful ability. Once per short rest, you can charm or frighten every enemy within 10 feet of you. And an AoE frighten effect is really, really strong in the early game. You probably don't have good AoE control at level 1. Most characters don't get that. And the ability to just end a whole encounter by casting this one ability is really powerful. So this is a really nice ability to get. You also get the expanded spell list for Archfey Warlock, and this is where the class falls down a little. This expanded spell list is mostly duds. There are not that many powerful spells on the list, though Plant Growth is pretty nice to have access to. At level 6, you get Misty Escape, which again is a really strong defensive ability. A reaction to become invisible can prevent an entire turn's worth of actions from your enemies. It will sometimes cause the enemy to redirect the rest of their turn to one of your allies, but if they can't reach them, it's going to cost them half a turn, and it just makes this character immune to being attacked for the rest of the turn most of the time, You then also get a free cast of Misty Step, which of course is a very powerful repositioning tool, so a really nice ability there. Greater Invisibility, pretty good spell to have as well. And then finally, at level 10, you get Beguiling Defenses, which prevents you from being charmed. Now, there are some effects that count as charm that you do care about in the late game. Mostly, though, this isn't super impactful. So when you put it together, Archfey Warlock really has two very nice things about it. Fey Presence is a busted early game ability. AoE control that strong just isn't available otherwise. And Misty Escape is an extraordinarily potent defensive reaction. You also get some okay spells. Greater Invisibility is nice. Plant Growth is great on Warlock, so you get some good options there. But mostly you're looking at those two abilities, and those two abilities are very strong. The reason people tend to overlook Archfey Warlock, and I think in this case it's literally overlook, they just forget it exists, is that all the other Warlock subclasses get used tons in builds. In particular, Gulock gets used in critical hit and fear builds, and Hexblade is just absurdly broken, so gets used in everything. Fiend Warlock is Will's canonical class, so you see that a lot as well, and it's also very powerful for melee characters, especially before Hexblade existed. So Archfey Warlock kind of gets left out of build optimization because it doesn't have a natural home. It's also, just like we've seen many times, more control and defense-oriented. Its best abilities are a very strong AoE control ability and a very strong defensive reaction. And so, unlike characters that are more damage-focused, it's much harder to see the impact that Archfey Warlock has. Now, I do think that this character class does have some genuine weaknesses. But Archfey Warlock is still a very powerful character. I think a lot of people love the theming and get told never to play this subclass, and I want to push back against that. If you like Archfey Warlocks, you will have a good time playing one. There are some real weaknesses, though. It has the weakest packed spell list overall. The other Warlocks all get much better spell access. And your strong ability is also pretty dangerous to use. Only 10-foot radius on Fey Presence means you do have to put yourself in a risky position to make use of it. So with great power comes great risk in this case. You also have no real capstone ability, though Warlocks mostly don't get one, but immunity to charm is just not that exciting, especially compared to some of the things that the other Warlocks get in the late game. But Archfey Warlock's control and defensive abilities make for just a really solid character that's going to be great at being a more spellcasting focused Warlock. And coming in at number 2, and this is the class that I personally have been most wrong about, Wild Magic Sorcerer. So Wild Magic Sorcerer, of course, provides a bunch of random effects, and randomness seems really dangerous when you're playing Honor Mode. I often say the enemy of optimization is randomness, which means that you would naturally assume Wild Magic Sorcerer is very difficult to play in an optimal way. Turns out that's actually not true. Let's take a look at its abilities. So at level 1, you get Wild Magic, where whenever you cast a spell of level 1 or higher, you might trigger a random effect. It's a 1 in 20 chance of happening by default, so most of the time this won't happen, but it will 1 in 20 times. The same, of course, as rolling a natural 1. There are 23 possible Wild Magic Surge effects. About 2/3 are beneficial to you, or neutral, and about 1/3 are detrimental, although of the detrimental ones, I think there's only 5 that are really bad. So the chances of rolling into something that really genuinely hurts you are only about 1 in 100 on casting a spell. Obviously, 1 in 100 is still pretty dangerous, but you can see that Wild Magic Sorcerer's negative impacts are less impactful than you might think, and there's a lot of other ways to manipulate that in your favor. In addition to that, you get Tides of Chaos, which will let you activate to gain advantage on your next attack roll, skill check, or save. Obviously, really strong there. And then Bend Luck, which is essentially guidance, but which costs 2 sorcery points to use, giving you a d4 bonus to ability checks, attack rolls, or saving throws. So it's a combo of guidance and bardic inspiration / cutting words. So you get some really strong ability to manipulate die roll. Finally, at level 11, you get Controlled Chaos, which causes enemy spellcasters. You can to occasionally suffer the wild magic surge effects. And they get a smaller list of possible effects, so they'll mostly only suffer from the negative effects. Though, obviously, if they do roll the action surge, you can see in this table, they've listed which ones they roll. If they do roll the action surge, that's really bad for you, but mostly it's going to do something that is harmful to them when you hit them with controlled chaos. So what's good about Wild Magic Sorcerer starts with, of course, it's a sorcerer. Sorcerer is generically the strongest class in Baldur's Gate 3 overall. Action economy manipulation in a game about just taking as many actions as possible is always going to be incredibly strong. And in a game that doesn't restrict you from resting and recovering your resources, the class that's about burning briefly and brightly is going to shine more than other classes, because you can use all of your resources as quickly as possible and then recover them by long resting. So sorcerers are just generically going to be incredibly powerful. Wild Magic Sorcerer also gives you great die roll manipulation, with the gaining of advantage and the D4 cutting words effect. And in fact, I find that in practice, those abilities to manipulate randomness outweigh the randomness that Wild Magic Sorcerer introduces and makes it a less random character than most others, because you can manipulate your die rolls. Finally, you also get incredible high rolls. When you do get lucky on Wild Magic Sorcerer and roll like the action surge or turn all of your enemies into cats, obviously that's going to win the encounter outright. So while you don't rely on good Wild Magic surges, they're more likely than bad ones, and when you get a really good one, it's of course incredibly powerful. So why did I miss so badly evaluating this character? I think in my subclass tier list, almost 2 years ago now, I gave it a C tier. And this, of course, was before I had done a full honor playthrough with the character. But I think that was a pretty bad miss rating the strength of Wild Magic Sorcerer. And why are people generally scared of this character? Well, firstly, it requires a pretty high burden of knowledge. You should have a general sense of what possible wild magic surges there are, though I do think that a really fun way to play Wild Magic Sorcerer is to go in completely blind and just see random stuff happening. That's always going to be super fun. But if you want to optimize it, you should probably know what can possibly happen so you can plan around it. In general, the rule of thumb is stay at least 30 feet away from your allies and nothing bad will happen to them. And then even if something bad happens to you, your allies will be able to help you recover from it. It also seems extremely luck-based. Obviously, it's got randomness all over the class in the description, in the name and everything, so it seems like it's going to be much more random than it actually is in practice. In practice, you can control for the randomness. And so it's not as much of a factor as you would expect, but it looks like it's going to be very random. And it is also true that when things go wrong for Wild Magic Sorcerer, they go spectacularly wrong and very memorably. The time when you cast a spell and summon a Cambion that wipes your whole party, you're going to remember. And I myself will talk about doing that with the first spell that I cast in the game on the starting beach. But those times are going to be pretty aberrant luck. You will end up with, and a lot of the times, if you were that unlucky on a normal character, you would have lost anyways. To get, like, the Cambion summon, you need to roll the 1 in 20 Magic Surge, and then roll the 1 in 23 chance of summoning the Cambion, and have that actually cost you the encounter. That's usually the most dangerous one. And a lot of the times, if you're in a position where that would cost you the encounter, 2 natural 1s in a row would have also cost you the encounter. So there are plenty of times when Wild Magic Sorcerer's exposure to random chance isn't actually greater than a normal character, it's just more visible. So in practice, your weaknesses actually don't really exist. Wild Magic Sorcerer is significantly less random than it seems once you know how to plan around the Wild Magic surges. And you're a sorcerer, so you can usually be so ahead in an encounter because you're so good at doing sorcerer stuff that you're by default going to win any encounter, that even if things do go wrong, you should be in a good enough position to recover from them. That said, extremely getting, extremely unlucky can still ruin you completely. And I don't want to downplay the fact that there are more lost conditions for Wild Magic Sorcerer than other characters. They're just much less likely than they look at first glance when you look at the character. And in practice, this is actually an extremely strong honor mode character, like every sorcerer. And coming in at number 1, regular viewers of the channel will definitely have been able to guess what class is going in this spot. We have the Glamour Bard. This is one of the most derided subclasses in the game since it launched in patch 8. There was a lot of backlash against this character class and people calling it completely useless, which is very odd for a character that's just very solid overall and a very strong contributor to an honor mode party. Let's take a look at its abilities. Glamour Bard really only gets 2 subclass abilities. Later ones are just improvements to the previous abilities. At level 3, you get Mantle of Inspiration, which lets you add 5 temp HP to 2 of your allies, so 10 total temp HP, at the cost of a Bardic Inspiration point. This is fairly plentiful, so you can refresh it pretty frequently, and once you get Font of Inspiration at level 5, you can refresh this much more regularly, giving your whole party quite a bit more HP. In addition to that, if those allies, while they have this temp HP, are hit by a melee attack, the attacker becomes charmed, and the charm source counts as the character that had the temp HP. A charmed creature can't attack the creature that charmed it, so a melee character that attacks one of your allies, gets charmed, will then not be able to attack that ally again. Against any melee enemy that takes multiple turns or uses bonus actions to make an extra attack, this can often cost them turns because they'll have to switch targets and often won't be able to reach another valid character to attack. So you can cost enemies a lot of turns passively using Mantle of Inspiration. At level 6, it goes up to 3 characters, and they get 8 HP, and at level 10, it goes up to 4 for 11 HP, which is 44 HP per inspiration die. At this point, you can get up to 1,000 or so HP over the course of a day. If you're depleting it all, you won't get that much in practice, but it's still a ton of effective HP for your party. In addition to that, at level 6, you get Mantle of Majesty Command. This is a once per long rest ability where you can cast Command as a bonus action and then recast it every turn as a bonus action. And if they're charmed, like by Mantle of Inspiration, though also by other charm effects, they automatically fail the save. So that lets you set up Command with no saving throw as a bonus action every turn for 10 turns, because there's no save on the charm on the melee attack. You can do this manually by triggering attacks of opportunity with those characters, and then you can use Mantle of Majesty to lock enemies out. All of these abilities also ignore a lot of the normal immunities. The charm from Mantle of Inspiration goes through some charm immunities, though not all, and the command from Mantle of Majesty works on characters that are normally immune to command. So you have a lot of no save, no immunity ability to lock enemies out of encounters. So when you look at that, you can see the strengths of that right away. You get lots of temporary health, which of course keeps your party alive for longer, prevents you using healing, and so on, and makes them have higher maximum health, which is also pretty important because it means that enemies need to do more total damage before a character dies. You get tons of disruption for free against melee enemies. You can often ruin their turns entirely because they'll get charmed. They'll maybe go switch to a different ally and then get charmed and lose another turn. Any character that's making multiple attacks in a turn, whether they have action surge or multiple actions by default, whether they're using their bonus actions to attack, will often lose those effects completely. So it's sort of like free slow, reducing enemies to one action if you arrange the attacks appropriately. In addition to that, you just get a no save bonus action, win the encounter button in a lot of encounters because Mantle of Majesty Command, once per long rest, just lets you win an encounter outright. No save command as a bonus action for 10 turns is enough, obviously, to win almost any encounter against one powerful enemy or one boss and a few adds, stuff like that. And although this is only a long rest ability, you still have all your bardic spellcasting, so yes, you can only use it on one encounter, but you won't need to burn anything else on that encounter, so Glamour Bard actually can usually go longer before resting than other characters because you have the ability to win an encounter outright with one ability. Finally, of course, you're a bard. Bards have lots of out-of-combat utility and great spell casting and good combat access as well. You get magical secrets and so on. Being a bard is just very good by default, so Glamour Bard gets a bunch of bonuses on top of a very good chassis as well. So why do people dislike this subclass? And something that I think is really cool about Glamour Bard, by the way, is that this subclass draws extremely strong emotional reactions from the player base, which is great design. You want people to care about a subclass. But something that I've found generally fascinating is that my pretty lukewarm take that this is a 7.5 or 8 out of 10 pretty decent character, not the best, but far from the worst, draws a lot of really strong reactions in the comments, which I think is really cool that it does that. So I think there's a couple reasons people feel so strongly about Glamour Bard. Firstly, it does no damage, and this is a real weakness. I've put it both in the real weaknesses section and in the perceived weaknesses section. A character that doesn't bring damage to the table definitely needs to bring other stuff in order to be good, and a party that lacks too much damage is really going to struggle. But this is again a case where damage really has an outsized impact on people's perceptions of how good a character is. It makes for really big numbers, and those are very obvious and easy to analyze. It also looks really good in a, Reddit comment title or a YouTube thumbnail to have a really big damage number. So those tend to be the characters that people gravitate towards as representing what a strong character looks like. A pure support character like Glamour Bard has a much more subtle effect on the game, and it's harder to see what it's doing, especially because with Glamour Bard in particular, so much of its value is in things that the enemies aren't doing, which are just difficult to see happening in actual play, even though they are happening and giving you a lot of value overall. Glamour Bard is also genuinely really bad for solo play. And I think that this comes up a lot in Baldur's Gate 3 discourse, because a lot of the sort of most popular ways to talk about character optimization, and a lot of creators who are really focused on character optimization are focused on solo honor mode. So if somebody says this character's bad, talking about solo honor mode, it can be easy for that opinion to filter out of that without the context, and then that just becomes common wisdom. So because there's so much solo play in terms of how people analyze characters, the fact that it's really good in groups can be overwritten by the fact that it's bad in solos. Finally, of course, it requires a lot of tactical play. Glamour Bard is genuinely fairly demanding to play. You need to position your characters appropriately so that enemies are actually losing turns to the charm. You need to use your Mantle of Majesty in the right encounter for it, because it's a very impactful, very important ability. And you need to know a lot of spacing. You need to know the trick with using attacks of opportunity to charm enemies so that you can then hit them with Mantle of Majesty. So there's a high burden of knowledge and a lot of demand on the player. Bards are also a little bit harder to play than other classes because they tend not to do direct damage, so you need to contribute in other ways. And of course, Swords Bard exists, and Sword Bard is broken. Overall, the best subclass in the game. Hard not to compare Glamour Bard to Sword Bard, even though the two subclasses are doing completely different things. So all of that makes people evaluate this character as significantly worse than I think it actually is. Now, that said, this subclass does have real weaknesses. It doesn't do damage. It does need specific team compositions. You usually want at least 2 melee allies to get the most out of Glamour Bard. And you need your other party members to be able to deal damage because you have a character that's not doing it and it is instead focused on defense and control exclusively. Finally, there are some encounters that are a little harder. Ranged enemies can strip off the temp HP, so you need to be careful with that. Obviously, ranged enemies are the most dangerous in the game anyways for most characters, so that doesn't change the way you play, but it is a real weakness of the character. As I said, I think that this character is, a solid A-tier character. It really shines in certain team compositions and is going to be much weaker in other team compositions. But Glamour Bard is also really fun and super tactical to play, and if you're playing a team with a couple melee characters, highly recommend giving it a shot. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the most underrated subclasses in the game, and I hope it inspires you to play a character that you maybe wouldn't have played otherwise because people kept telling you it was bad. I think there are some really interesting systemic issues in the way that the community as a whole evaluates the strength of characters, and this is true not just in Baldur's Gate, but in games in general, is that things that give big numbers and visual demonstrations of their strength will be easier to evaluate, and thus people will tend to rate those higher than things that have more subtle effects. So if you have your eye out for that type of bias, it can give you a better sense of how to approach building characters in games and how to approach getting good information from build guides and video creators and people who make characters. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you think that there are other underrated subclasses, in particular ones you think I underrate, I'm very interested in hearing about that. I'm always interested in hearing about things that I might have gotten wrong, especially if I'm undershooting on my evaluation of something, then that's going to be very interesting to me. So definitely let me know in the comments if there's any of those. And of course, if you've enjoyed the video, then you can feel free to leave any comment. Doesn't matter what it is all is food for the almighty algorithm. And hit the like button, which of course helps me out as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. You can also subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 strategy videos and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.